It's time for the first session of the Hindu Lit for Life 2014. Man Booker Prize winning author Aravind Adiga in conversation with David Godwin. May I request them to please come on to the stage. Chennai-born Aravind Adiga won the Man Booker Prize for Literature in 2008 for his first novel, The White Tiger. His second novel, Last Man in Tower, was published in 2011. He has also written a collection of short stories, Between the Assassinations. A publisher for many years, David Goodwin, decided in 1995 that he didn't fit in the new corporate field of publishing and became a literary agent instead. David Goodwin Associates is now one of London's leading agencies with a diverse and impressive set of writers, from Booker Prize winners Aravind Adiga, Arundhati Roy, to well-known biographers Richard Holmes, Claire Tomalin, and poets such as Simon Armitage and Michael Simmons Roberts. David's own book, Breaking 80, a short memoir of his life and golf, was published in 2011. The stage is now yours, gentlemen. I hope you enjoy this session.
Does this work? Yep. Well, good morning, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. The first question I have for Aravind is, we're here in Chennai. What's it like?
Yeah, it's always great to be here, because I was born in Chennai, not far from here, in a clinic off Punamali High Road. And my first home was right here in Chennai, my grandfather's house, which still stands on Punamali High Road. My first school was here, Don Bosco. And I was here till I was about 6 years old, when my parents moved to Mangalore. And I lived in Mangalore till I was 16, but every summer we would come back here. For 2 months, every summer I would come back to my grandfather's home. And there were two trains from Mangalore. One was the Madras Mail and the other was the West Coast Express. And these trains, even though Mangalore and Madras are pretty much on a straight line in the map of India, the Indian Railways had decided that the trains would go all the way down to Kerala and come all the way up. So they took something like 20 hours for a very short trip. And it was great. So we would take the West Coast Express, which I think left at night and got here in the afternoon, or the Madras Mail, which left Mangalore in the afternoon and got here early morning. And the 2 months that followed, the summer holidays here, were just the happiest time of the year for me. Because it was my mother, me, and my brother Anand, who now lives in San Francisco. And we would spend 2 months of the year here in my grandfather's house in Punamali High Road. And I still remember coming out of the train and turning around to see this, Madras Central Station. And I knew that I would have a terrific time. So Madras is always associated with, Chennai is always associated with very good times here. But my family's roots go quite deep here. I still get letters from people in Chennai asking for information on a man named U. Krishna Rao, who was the mayor of Madras in the 1940s, and then served in Rajaji's cabinet, and was Speaker of the Legislative Assembly when he died in 1961. U. Krishna Rao was my grandfather's elder brother. My grandfather, Mohan Rao, was a prominent surgeon here. And for many years you could meet people from Chennai of a certain generation who knew of him. But his elder brother was far more famous because he was a politician here for the Congress. And I still get queries from people about him. I know very little about him except what my mother said, that he owned a fabulous mansion on Rithenden Road. So whenever I see the film Citizen Kane and I see this mansion Xanadu, I think of this house on Rithenden Road. Because apparently you could get lost in it. There were so many rooms. And my grandfather and his brother were part of this generation that migrated here from Udupi in Karnataka in the 19th century, because the coast of Karnataka was then part of Madras Presidency. So if you were a young man and you wanted to make your fortune, you would have to leave Udupi and Karnataka and come here. And it was this migration to Chennai in the 19th century that also produced the Udupi Hotel. So everyone in India knows of the standard South Indian hotel called the Udupi Hotel, but that did not originate in Udupi, it began here. Just like the French restaurant began outside France, the Udupi Hotel began here in Madras. And in my childhood, I remember my childhood being dominated by the great Udupi hotels of Madras, which were owned by distant family members. And two in particular, the Dasa Prakash and the Woodlands Hotel. The Dasa Prakash was just opposite to where we lived, and we would get breakfast sent over from there in the mornings. And for years, wherever I went in India, I would look out for the Dasa Prakash Hotel. Because at one point it was a great chain across India, and now it's sort of collapsed. But I remember years ago when I lived in New Delhi, going to meet Khushwant Singh, because I was then a reporter for Time magazine, and I was very excited to meet Khushwant Singh, whose works I had read as a boy. And Khushwant Singh lives in Sujant Singh Park, a part of Delhi that his father built. And I was a bit early for the appointment, and I walked across to a hotel called the Ambassador Hotel, a very old Delhi hotel. And I began talking to the manager, and he said that years ago there had been a Dasa Prakash restaurant there. And I was very happy that these two institutions of my childhood, the Dasa Prakash Hotel and Khushwant Singh, had lived right opposite each other for many years. Well, Khushwant Singh is still around. The Dasa Prakash is all but gone now. So my family's roots here are very deep, and I come quite often. Last year I was here 3 times in Chennai, but it was really to see Tamil Nadu. I traveled across the state last year, so I'm here all the time. But this is your first visit here.
Oh, yeah, it's my first visit. Have you ever written about Chennai?
Not really, no. But I'll be taking David to see this tomorrow, Madras Central.
Very good. Now, I'm going to ask you about your career now, because the very first book I think you published was a book of stories. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So I left India in 1990 because my mother died very unexpectedly here in Chennai. She was diagnosed with cancer, and she died a few weeks later in the Cancer Institute in Adyar. And this happened in 1990, and that was a kind of big rupture in my life. So I left India in 1990, and I came back after over a decade. I came back as a reporter for Time magazine, and this sent me to New Delhi. And my entire life in India, the first 16 years of my life, had been spent in the south, in Mangalore or in Madras. I mean, Chennai, and I'd rather gone to the north. So New Delhi was something of a shock. And it was in New Delhi that I came up with the idea that I would try to write something. Initially, it was a series of stories, and then it became a novel on the changes in India. I think the day I wanted to start writing about India, I remember it clearly. It was in New Delhi. There was then something called the Foreign Correspondents Club, which probably still exists near Pragati Maidan. I was meeting an Indian man from South Africa, from Durban, and I was curious to know what life in South Africa was like, especially for Indian origin people. And we met quite late at the Foreign Correspondents Club, and around 11 o'clock we decided to leave. And this man just asked me, how are we getting home? And I said, because I didn't have a car then, I said, we're getting home the normal way. We'll go out and take an auto rickshaw. And he said, are you mad? We can't do this. We're going to get killed. I said, no, we won't get killed. Nothing's going to happen to us. And he was absolutely terrified at my suggestion that we just go out, and go home. Because he told me, in Durban, you can't do this. You can't just go out and take, it's very dangerous. So he was so attuned to life in South Africa that he was surprised that people in India, men I should say, even then, Delhi had a reputation for being unsafe for women, but that men were so casual about going out late at night in Delhi. And he got home safe, and the next day he called me up. He was curious to know why India was so safe. He said that, that given the fact that India was similar to South Africa in some ways, we had a very deep class divide. We also had a structure of domestic servants in homes, where domestic servants had intimate access to the finances of their masters and their personal lives. People in Delhi in those days would often trust their servants with large sums of money to take their children to school. And this struck him as similar to South Africa, and yet we in India had nothing like the crime problem that they had there. And I became intrigued by his question, why India was so safe. Because many Indians feel that cities are not safe here, but really, statistically, it's a very safe country, especially given the fact that we have conditions that should lead to much higher levels of crime. These two factors I've mentioned, a very deep class divide, and the fact that we have a structure, we have this domestic servant structure where poor people have extraordinary access to the homes of their masters. So why was India so safe? That was a question that bothered me for years. And under what conditions would this system change? And sort of this question was worked out both in a few short stories I wrote then, which were published later as a collection of stories called Between the Assassinations, in which, and a variation on that was The White Tiger, which was written in about 2006 and 2007.
But Delhi in The White Tiger is not a safe place. Is
Well,
it?
the white tiger, yeah, it's. I should just step back a little bit, yeah. So, when I was working for Time magazine in New Delhi from 2003 to 2006, the bureau chief was an Englishman called Alex Perry, who had got into a lot of trouble for various reasons. He was a very good reporter, but he had a tendency of getting the Prime Minister of India upset routinely, for instance. But Alex was an interesting man. He had a driver called Rakesh. I think Rakesh was a Malayali Christian who had lived in Delhi all his life, spoke Hindi. Rakesh would sit outside Alex's office reading a magazine in Hindi. And, I'd just come back to India. I can read Hindi, so in Mangalore, the Hindi is not my primary language. We were taught Devanagari. I kept thinking, I must be reading this incorrectly, because if he seems to be reading a magazine, Alex's driver, Rakesh, seems to be reading a magazine called Murder, right in here. And this can't be happening. Why would a driver be sitting out reading a magazine called Murder? One day I just went up to Rakesh and asked him what was this. This was a cheap pulp Hindi magazine. And he told me this was very popular among drivers in Delhi, this magazine. And it was full of stories in which drivers killed their masters. Now, Rakesh was a very good driver. He was someone you could trust, like most drivers in Delhi at that stage. I'm talking of events from 2003 and 4. And he was very reliable. He was a very honest man. And he was reading this magazine every day, right in front of Alex, his boss, in which drivers, because I could read Hindi then, and I asked him to help me through with reading the stories in this magazine. And then walking around New Delhi, I was struck by how many such magazines were published, pulp magazines cheaply printed in Hindi. I lived in a place called Nizamuddin then, East Nizamuddin, and then I moved to the west near the Dargah. And Nizamuddin is the home of a train station in Delhi. And every evening these men come, men from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, large numbers of men, because they visit the Dargah, which is the saint's tomb. And after they perform their prayers at the Dargah, they have nowhere to stay, and often they're just staying out under the flyovers, which are then coming up in Delhi. And just walking around Nizamuddin in the evening and then going to Old Delhi, I was struck by this extraordinary sight of a nocturnal, a second India. These men sitting under lamplights reading magazines and newspapers in Urdu, or reading magazines in Hindi. And I had this vision suddenly, of all these men reading magazines called Murder. And I began thinking of whether India, which seems like a very free society, and is a free society for someone like me, I'm middle class, but does it actually have mechanisms of social control that keep it safe? And if so, what are these mechanisms? Because the idea of these drivers reading a magazine called Murder, in which drivers kill their masters and then always get caught, it struck me as what you would consider catharsis, as a purging out of an emotion. This magazine made its way into the White Tiger. It's a real magazine. It's still published. I checked last time I was in Delhi. Murder still comes out. It's pretty much the same format. I became curious about this question, why India was so safe. What were the conditions? This is something that middle-class Indians largely take for granted. You have an extraordinary sumptuousness of safety. In Bombay, a city with very great class divides, you can go to a party in Juhu, in Bandra. You can leave at 2 in the morning, take an auto rickshaw. You can walk home if you're a man. But in Bombay, to some extent, this is true across class lines. We have no danger of kidnapped here. For instance, kidnapping for money is such a common phenomenon in Latin America. It's very rare here. If it happens, it makes the newspapers at once, because we think this is not the way life in India operates. Why is India so safe? It's something we take for granted. And under what conditions can it change? So the White Tiger, was a kind of thought experiment. It wasn't meant to be, a very similitudinous picture of life in India. It was me trying to think under what conditions life in India could change. I've always been fascinated by the idea of an alternative history of India. That the version of the stories we are told about India, about its independence, are not entirely true. That one of the things you have to do as a writer is come up with an alternative version of India. This idea goes back to my childhood, because I remember reading an interview when I was a boy with a great Bengali actor called Utpal Dutt. And Utpal Dutt was a man many people here would know as a very funny comic actor, but in his younger years he had been a Naxalite and had written a play on the Bombay Naval Mutiny. It's an event that happened in 1946 that most Indians don't know about, where part of the Navy mutinied in Bombay. And Utpal Dutt said that this event was the trigger, was the proximate reason for the British departure from India. that most Indians, if asked to say why the British had left India, would say that, a non-violent movement led by the Congress Party under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi forced the British to leave India, and that there were violent events associated with independence, like the Indian National Army, Subhash Chandra Bose, the Telangana Uprising, the Chittagong, the Bombay Naval Mutiny, but most Indians would feel these were dead ends. That violence was not the reason we got our independence, that non-violence was the reason we got our independence. But Utpal Dutt, was questioning this. And I remember I was 10 or 12 when I read this, and I was very fascinated. I went to the public library in Mangalore, the Karnat Sadashiv Rao Library, and I began reading up. India is a free society. You can get present in any version of events, but you just have to go to your public library and you'll find books that would challenge that. And I remember reading this book that suggested the Quit India movement. In school we had been taught the Quit India movement of 1942 was the reason the British left India. It's a book written by an Indian that said the Quit India movement was a disaster. It just handed Pakistan over to, it played into the hands of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. It was a tactical blunder. I began to think there might be another version of telling our independence movement in which violence played a bigger role. In a sense, so the idea of writing an alternative history of India, I began looking for material both on the far right and the far left that would challenge the conventional view of Indian independence. And the idea of writing an alternative history of India is actually one of my short stories which came out. But The White Tiger is an alternative future, if you will. It's again playing with the idea that violence, the White Tiger is about freedom, about how a man becomes free, and the idea that violence can be, something liberating.
It's funny though, isn't it? I remember when The White Tiger was published, people in Delhi telling me that it was completely untrue.
David told me the story. I have to tell them this.
No, it's true. I mean, actually, I was told by a number of people that their drivers actually love them.
Right.
And this was
well, that convinced me the White Tiger was right. I mean, you said, remember this, David told me that he had gone to someone's home and they brought the drivers out to tell. Yeah. I mean, come on. I mean,
it's interesting that people take novels as kind of depictions of some kind of truth element here. Whereas, of course, these are novels. I mean, the nature of novels is that you twist and turn the material. So you're not writing some naturalistic description of life in Delhi.
No, it wasn't meant to be a naturalist. I reread The White Tiger for the first time in about 5 years to prepare for this event because I haven't read it. It was written, there was a first version of it written when I lived in New Delhi, Nizamuddin, around 2006. And then I moved to Mumbai, moved to Santa Cruz, and I finished it there. It was published in 2008, and I haven't read it since, so the first time in about 5 years. And rereading it, I was struck by how a lot of the questions I get asked and a lot of the debate, is focused on about 10 or 15% of the book. Because the core of the book, in my mind, I remember this now, was trying to figure out, again, the question of freedom, how a man becomes free, and what it would mean for an urban migrant coming into New Delhi to become free. When I was a boy, I was very struck by the works of a man named Sudhir Kakar. In the 1980s, he was one of the few intellectuals who was doing work on, he's a psychoanalyst, he did work on the Freudian interpretations of art and literature in India. And around 2005, I met Sudhir Kakar at an event hosted by Madhu Jain, the journalist in New Delhi. And I went back and I read his works again. And Sudhir Kakar has done work that very few others have done. He was looking at the transformations that happen in stories of urban migration. When people leave their villages and come to big cities in India, how their lives change. Now, mostly we look at urban migration from the point of view of the economic changes that happen, that you gain greater freedom. Sudhir Kakar had written a few essays. Now, it's been many years since I read them, and they may have shifted in my mind. He was looking at stories, letters written home by migrants, back to their villages and trying to understand how these people had changed as a result of living in the city. And one of the biggest changes that happen when you come from a village to the city is you gain control over your own sexuality. Right? You can choose to marry. You have greater freedom now than you ever had before. Your marriage, your sex life are largely in your own hands for the first time. And this is both a great freedom and also a great threat because potentially, if you say no to the wedding that's been arranged for you, you're cutting yourself off from your society, from your caste, from your village. You're in danger of going adrift. So the control over your own sex life, the right to choose whom you marry, when to marry, is both a great freedom and a threat. And Sudhir Kakar had a few essays on this that struck me very much. And one of the things if I remember right, Sudhir Kakar was writing about was a number of times urban migrants, when they wrote letters home, when they tried to tell the story of coming to Delhi or coming to Bombay, the number of times that an animal motive would recur, that they would be fixated on a parrot, on some kind of animal they had seen, and this would be obsessively repeated in this letter. And Kakar, I think, had suggested that this repeated animal motive might be their way of dealing with this beautiful and dangerous thing, their sexuality, which they had gained control of. Anyway, I was very struck by this and many of his other ideas.
The white tiger, presumably.
Yeah, I was looking. So when I was in Delhi, I used to travel a lot. I used to go about. There are 3 big forts in Delhi that I visited a lot: the Lal Killa, the Red Fort, and then the Purana Killa, which is Sher Shah Suri's fort, Humayun's fort, and the 3rd fort is the Tughlaqabad fort, which actually which I transferred into the White Tiger. But these 3 forts. I spent every Sunday at one of these 3, and near near the Purana Killa, you have the National Zoo, or the big zoo in Delhi, and there's a white tiger there. And I was very struck by this animal because, the white tiger with its pattern of white and black shading, as it walks around a cage with black bars, you have a strobe effect. It seems to be disintegrating because there's a paralleling between its stripes and the bars of the cage. And it's a very surreal kind of thing just to stand there and watch this animal. And these animals in a zoo, they seem to go mad. They just seem to be, mesmerizing themselves. I was very struck by this very beautiful and strange animal, and I thought this would be a metaphor for this. But, in all these years, the white tiger's, done reasonably well. It's been published in other countries. But no one ever brings it up. I've got to tell you, only one man, I think, has actually understood the white tiger. Some years ago, I went to see the filmmaker Ram Gopal Varma, because I find from his early films, Satya and Company, quite interesting. So he gave me an appointment. I went to his office in Oshiwara. He was late, of course, like everyone in Bombay. Bollywood keeps you waiting. He comes after an hour. He sort of looks at me, and Ram Gopal Varma has very big, bulging eyes, and he just stared at me for a while, and I didn't know what he was doing. And someone told me, when a stranger walks into Ram Gopal Varma's office, he's just thinking, do I owe this man money? Like, do I need to run? And finally, he figured out that I was just there to talk. And he said, yes, he was relaxed. He said, Mr. Adiga, I know you're famous for something, but what? I have no idea. And I said, I wrote a book called The White Tiger. He said, White Tiger, yes. I don't read books. Tell me what it's about in one sentence, because I'll give you one sentence narration. I said, White Tiger is about a driver who kills his master. And he said, fantastic, brilliant. I love the idea. But you picked a bad title, he said. I said, why? He said, because the white tiger is a beautiful animal, he said. It's not a violent animal. It doesn't threaten me. It sounds like a love story, not a murder story. And I thought, of all the millions of people who read the book, one man gets it. Ram Gopal Varma.
But what should you have called it something else then? What was the other title?
No, it was the only
You should have asked him what he was to call the book, I think.
I was getting concerned also, talking of animals and me and Ram.
The murderous driver. But I mean, your life.
No, there was a real case in Delhi. There was a real case in Delhi around 2006 of a chauffeur who had killed his master, who had beaten. He was in the employ of a major builder in New Delhi. Had killed his boss by beating him to death with a pair of golf clubs. It's an extraordinary story. And initially, that was the plot of The White Tiger. I'm really disappointed that I changed.
Just to be fussy, any particular golf club? I mean,
I know we should rewrite The White Tiger, and we will have golf, because David's an expert on golf, and you can do the golf bits.
Okay, I want to know. I mean, you write The White Tiger, sitting up in Delhi or whatever. You finish it, it gets published, and suddenly it wins this huge prize, and suddenly you go from, well, I mean, your life changed, did it not?
Yes, of course.
For the better?
Well, it's very difficult to get published. It's always a struggle. There are many, many very gifted authors who either don't get published or get published and don't get a chance for a second book. So I'm very grateful for anything that I'm very grateful to be published and to have a chance to publish again. And that said, it is a huge. It's also. It can be a problem also to have too much publicity and too much attention early on. It changes the way people see you. It often makes it hard to interact with people. But on the whole, I'm grateful. It is a matter of luck, but I'm grateful to have had a chance to write and to keep writing. It's a great luxury to wake up in the morning and write. When I was a student at Oxford in the 1990s, Vikram Seth had come to speak. This was 1998. I think I was a student at Magdalen College, and they said Vikram Seth would come. It was a hall like this. I turned up, and it was packed. I sat way at the top, and it was terrific to hear him speak because he read beautifully from his own work. And if any of you ever get a chance to hear Seth, read from his work, I hope you'll take it. I haven't seen him since '98, but I thought that would be. I couldn't imagine having a life like that. I thought I was going to be an academic. I was doing my MPhil at Oxford, and then I got into Princeton to do a PhD in English. I thought that was going to be my life as an academic. I couldn't imagine a life like this. It just seemed like it would take too much. It would be too much a matter of chance to be able to live as a writer. So I'm very grateful for the prize, which has given me a chance to do this. But
well, perhaps one day you should do an event with Vikram, which would be good. Good to see you together.
Well, he was terrific. He's a very, very fine reader from his own work, which is not something I do well. Many people don't read well from their own work. And he had come with a few sheets of An Equal Music, which he had just written then. So he had published A Suitable Boy, which was such a big hit. And he came and he read a few sheets. And Vikram Seth stood for something that a man of Indian origin could write about anything. Because my brother had been a student at Stanford, when I think Vikram Seth was in the mathematics department or something there. And so, that entire generation of my brother and his fellow Indian students had idolized him because Seth was writing books like The Golden Gate, which seemed to have no Indian characters. It was a very unusual book. When I was young, Indian writing in English was dominated for me by R.K. Narayan, who's a very great writer. I still think The Guide, his book, is the best book. It's the best novel written by an Indian in English. And I keep rereading it, and it's a much deeper, much darker novel than it initially appears. But R.K. Narayan was my sense of what an Indian writer in English was going to be.
Is he still read now, Narayan?
Oh, very much so. Narayan is very much read. And it's funny, I was just thinking, what would R.K. Narayan be writing if he were alive today? And, any time I write an article in the Indian press, no matter how innocuous a subject it is, it could be on golf, I'm going to get a series of rejoinders from Chennai. It's just a series of very angry letters saying, you've got everything wrong, the basics are wrong. Your latest article reinforces the widely held opinion that your knowledge of India is gleaned entirely in the course of flying visits from your mansion in London, blah, blah, blah.
From people in Chennai?
Yeah.
Always from here?
There must be a professional writer of rejoinders in Chennai.
Maybe it's there. Maybe he's there, outside, amongst the audience here.
It must be. And R.K. Narayan will be writing this, the painter of science, the vendor of sweets, the writer of rejoinders. That would be his new novel set in Chennai. I'm sure there's a man somewhere because these letters are so good. They're so articulate and they're so nasty. I know there's a professional rejoinder writer, B.B. Balasubramaniam, rejoinders, retorts, reports, all causes taken, 500 rupees an hour. And this is what R.K. Narayan will be writing a novel. In fact, I should go and write it. I should just write the rejoinder writer. What do you think?
Well, not bad. I mean, might this be the next one, do you think?
No, actually, I was thinking, what would R.K. Narayan doing? The Chennai I grew up in is completely gone now, and for a long time I came here and I was looking for parts of my childhood that were lost, which is a mistake. I was looking for Madras, but I should be, now I've changed my attitude. I'm no longer here as a nostalgic sort of time traveler. I'm looking at the future, the new Chennai that's come up. Some years ago I was in Mumbai at the Strand bookstore and I asked the owner for a good book on Chennai, and he gave me a book that was called Chennai, Not Madras, edited by a man called Professor A.R. Venkatachalapati. And this book just changed my understanding of my childhood of Chennai. Because the book argued that the fact that Indian cities have changed their names is very controversial, so Bombay and Mumbai. But the change here was of a different nature and not to be embraced, because fundamentally Chennai was the Indian city and Madras was the old British city. And what has happened here, not just in the city, but in Tamil Nadu in the last few years, the last few decades, has been a great unleashing of energy, of entrepreneurial energy. You see this when last year I traveled across the state. It's the most impressive big state in India. I went to Trichy, Thanjavur, Velankani. On a separate trip, I went from Trivandrum, I went across to Kanyakumari, went all the way to Madurai via Tuticorin, Tuticorin and Ramanathapuram. Everywhere you go in the state, there's been a tremendous unleashing of energy. I think it's the most urbanized big state in India. I've traveled a lot of this country. Among smaller states, I think Tripura and Himachal Pradesh are the most impressive, but this is the most impressive big state in this country, and a number of indices match this out. So Kerala gets a lot of money from the Gulf, but Tamil Nadu does it without that crutch. And And Professor Venkatachalapathi's book and my travels here have convinced me that they've changed the way I look at the city. And I decided to teach myself Tamil because I was here till I was 6, so I can understand Tamil. But before I could read or write it, I was shifted out. And my brother can read and write Tamil because he was here till he was 11. And it's very difficult when you're grown up, when you're trying to teach yourself a new language. But to learn more about Tamil culture and to think of the future here. So I'm trying hard not to try to recover a piece of my past when I'm here.
But don't you think, one of the functions of literature is to recover the past in some way, or is that tremendously sentimental?
It can be, it depends. I think with Chennai, the greater excitement is discovering this incredibly dynamic city. Many Indians think of Chennai as a conservative city. I think it's a great mistake. It reminds me of a line in a novel called The Leopard. Lampedusa, the great Italian novel. It's set in Sicily at the time of the Risorgimento, and an aristocrat says, who's faced with the prospect of change, says, everything must change so that everything can stay the same. And Chennai has done that. Everything has changed, so it still appears to be the same. Girish Karnad has an essay in Kannada where he's talking about Girish Karnad, the playwright, spent 7 years here at the Oxford University Press. And he was talking about the fact that Tamilians can seem conservative, but actually he said the Madras Brahmin Society decreed that Bharatanatyam would be the dance form, would be not just acceptable but desirable for young women. That young women should be taught Bharatanatyam sometime in the 1910s or 20s, at a time when most of India still thought of dance as not a respectable thing for women to be learning. So there's a sense in which it's actually a very radical city, Chennai, and I'm eager to learn more about the future rather than go back to the past. I was thinking just yesterday, I got here yesterday, I was walking down Greaves Road and I saw a big sign saying Duggar, D-U-G-G-A-R. And I stopped because there was a boy in my school in Don Bosco called Sanjay Duggar. And his father was a very rich industrialist. And Sanjay was a North Indian, I think a Sindhi or a Marwadi, and he and I would go to see films together because I had no Hindi, so he would translate for me. And we saw Shan. I think it was Shan, the film where Amitabh Bachchan fights a crocodile, except we were very disappointed because it was a rubber crocodile. We were 6, but we could see. We thought Amitabh Bachchan should be fighting a real crocodile. But I kept in touch with Sanjay Duggar for many years. Whenever I came back here, I would see him. But I haven't seen him in 30 years. So I was about to go in and just ask if there was a boy called Sanjay, man called Sanjay Duggar. And I thought, no, Professor Venkatachalapathy would disapprove, because I'd be regressing into Madras, but I should be progressing into Chennai. So I should be doing something different, so I didn't go in.
But you were tempted.
I was tempted, but I think the great temptation is to see what lies ahead.
Are there great novels set, are there great novels set in Chennai? Or perhaps they're being written now, do you think?
Oh, no, there are. In Tamil, certainly. I think last year, for a couple of years, I've discovered the work of a writer named Ashoka Mitran. He's a great writer who writes in Tamil. I've visited him a couple of times, who lives in Velachery. There's plenty of stuff, but not much of it has been translated. Tamil is India's oldest living language. So, as I said, I'm teaching myself to read and write Tamil now. I'd gone to Malaysia last year, and there's a famous Murugan temple at a place called the Batu Caves, and I was... It's a center of Tamil culture in Malaysia. So I'd gone and see the temple. I'd come out, and there's a stack of Tamil books outside for children, alphabet books, and I'm struggling to make out because it's very different from the Kannada alphabet, which I read. And the little boy comes up to me. A Chinese lady comes up with a son, and the little boy picks up, and he's reading it fluently. And I began talking to the Chinese lady, and Malaysia has a big Tamil minority, and there are many Chinese Malays, and she was a Chinese lady who had married a Tamilian. And the husband had left her, but she was still making sure her boy learned Tamil. And this boy was just way better than me. And I thought I should make a real effort, because each time I stop learning Tamil, I think of that little boy must be fluent by now. And it's difficult because if you read Kannada, the Tamil alphabet is so radically unlike any other South Indian alphabet. It's a very simplified alphabet. It's a problem. One of my 3 visits here, I called a friend in Bangalore who speaks Tamil, and I asked him, who is this man, Jayankara, who owns all the hotels in Chennai? My friend said, there's no such name. It's not even a Tamil name. And he said, go and read the sign again. I said, the sign is everywhere in Chennai, Jayankara. And I went back and read it. It was Iyengar. Because the I, the Tamil I can double up as a J, and the Tamil K can double up as a G. So you keep making mistakes like this when you're trying to read Tamil, but I think in a couple of years, because Girish Karnad said in his 7 years here, he had learned the Tamil alphabet. He had learned the letters, but had not been able to put them together into a word when he left. So I'm thinking once you make the effort to learn the individual letters, you might as well read the whole thing. Then one day I may go to an office somewhere and see someone here reading a magazine in Tamil called Murder. And once again, I'll have another novel. By the way, I think if Sudhir Kakar ever found out, Sudhir is in Berlin right now, if he ever found out that his writings had inspired the White Tiger, he'd just be horrified. I think poor Sudhir, he sent me his new book, which is a psychoanalytic biography of Rabindranath Tagore. And I'm frightened to read it because that might inspire another murder novel. But Sudhir Kakar is a very good.
But you're not writing. I mean, you're writing now, but you're not. I mean, Chennai's. Will Chennai feature in a work of fiction? Do you think?
No, not really. I think it's. I love coming here. You don't have to be writing about a place. The inspiration you get from it, the energy you get from it, can help your other work.
No, but The Last Man is set in Bombay. I mean, clearly Bombay.
Yes, that's right.
White Tiger in Delhi. So I mean, they are particular books in that sense.
Yes, I lived in Bombay for a long time, so it was natural that you would write about the place you lived in. And sometimes you write about a place because you've had a very good year in it. So 2007, I was living in Mumbai. I had quit my job in Delhi and shifted to Mumbai in November of 2000. I was living in a flat in Santa Cruz East, which is not a particularly nice place. And I didn't know anyone in Bombay for about a year. It was completely alone, but I think it was the happiest time of my life. It was just wonderful. You were just writing, and no one knew where I was. And I think that was such a productive year that I had the ideas for 2 or 3 books in that year, in addition to The White Tiger. And these books will be, when you have a good year like that, you hope to capitalize on it, and the material you gain in that year can serve you for a long time to come. I think it'd be very hard for me. I think Mumbai is very essential to the way I want to write. And the idea, not the Mumbai, the glamorous Mumbai or the Mumbai of the extremes. There's something about life in Mumbai which reminds me of the middle-class upbringing I had in Mangalore. Because one of the things, even though my family was quite prosperous here, my granduncle died in 1961, Krishna Rao. It also marked the start of a great change in Chennai. Because by 1967, the Congress government had lost here. The last chief minister of Congress, Bhaktavatsalam, lost in 67. And the city became, I would say, unfriendly towards some of its ethnic minorities. So my family left Chennai, and there was a big downward social mobility that operated on me, on my family. So by the time I grew up, we often had very little money. But Mangalore was a city where you could have a good life, in a middle-class family. And parts of Mumbai struck me as being the most, solidly middle-class parts of India I've ever seen. There's a kind of Mumbai attitude, a disdain for money, a sort of very Maharashtrian attitude that I like very much. And I enjoy living in parts of Mumbai, and I hope to keep writing about Mumbai.
Excellent. Now, I didn't quite, timing-wise,
as you can see, it's not in English, it's in Kannada. The writer is a man named Jayant Kaikini. I think he's one of India's great short story writers. Unfortunately, his work is not known widely outside Karnataka. Jayant Kaikini is part of this remarkable group. As I said, being an ethnic minority here in Chennai, a part of the Kannada-speaking community of Madras, I'm very curious about other ethnic minorities in other Indian cities. And Kaikini is part of this remarkable community of Kannada speakers in Mumbai, he writes in Kannada, but his stories are all set in Mumbai, in suburbs of Mumbai like Mulund and Navi Mumbai, about working class people, mostly Maharashtrian working class people. And I think he's just one of the finest short story writers you're ever going to read anywhere. He's now moved back to Bangalore. He writes for the cinema. He's a lyricist, and he's a very fine, he's like a lyricist and a scriptwriter. I'm told that his work is being translated into English, will be published next year, and if any of you get a chance and you see the name Jayant Kaikini, I hope you buy his books. Kaikini, if you recognize the name, is a Saraswat name. I think he's a Konkani speaker. He's part of this extraordinarily gifted community where they live in Bombay, they speak Konkani at home, they write in Kannada, they go out and speak in Marathi or Hindi, and he's fluent in English as well. He worked as a biologist, I think, for many years.
Well, that's characteristically generous and a very good moment.
Yeah.
So I think I'd like to thank you. And, well, first time for a few years. Will you do it again?
No, I don't think so. I wanted, after I won the Booker Prize, David told me to do a big event, a public event in India, and I should have done it there. I found it very hard to cope with, this publicity. I remember one day picking up a Bombay paper and seeing a photograph of me in school. And I hadn't given them that photograph. I don't know who gave them that photograph. I'm still trying to find out, And then I thought I'd better not go out, but I'd better hide for a few years. And I thought, but I should speak once. And
Well, it's very good to have you back, if I may say so.
Well,
So thank you very much.